Hello, and welcome to the fourth webinar in a series to introduce educators to the new middle grades and high school teacher preparation standards for science in Michigan. I'm Darcy McMahon, higher education consultant with MDE. Today, I'm joined by an excellent team of science educators and teacher educators who were part of the stakeholder committee who revised these standards. Today, you'll hear from two colleagues from the authoring committee. Sarah Cartwright is a sixth grade science teacher at Heartland Middle School. Nathan Spencer is a science education consultant with Wayne County Regional Education Service Agency, where he provides professional learning and facilitation services to science teachers K-12 and other stakeholders in public education. The purpose of today's webinar is to ensure educator preparation providers build understanding of the faceted nature of the teacher preparation standards for science for middle grades and high school and the implications for programs. This work supports the Michigan Plan and Vision set forth in the MDE Top 10 Strategic Education Plan. This plan lays out a vision for every child in Michigan's public schools. As you'll recall, there are three facets in our new science standards. These three facets are identified as critical for well-prepared beginning science teachers. The facets work in a braided fashion, simultaneously, and ideally would be developed in this way in programs as well. You can see here the definitions for each facet. The science teaching practices are the what teachers do to teach science. The core knowledge facet is carefully aligned with the Next Gen Science Standards and Michigan Science Standards disciplinary core ideas, but with a deeper understanding of that particular content. It includes the pedagogical content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and understandings of students. Finally, the guiding principles are the how teachers are, or their way of being. They are intended to be a guiding framework for the thousands of decisions teachers will make in classrooms and with others. Here you can see the 8 science teaching practices, 6 domains of core knowledge, and 5 guiding principles that make up the facets. In this session, we will focus on the science teaching practices.
So now we'll spend some time developing an understanding of the instructional importance of these science teaching practices with students at all levels from K-16 by engaging students in learning science, supporting student social and emotional development, and ensuring responsible, safe science teaching practice. The research that led to the adoption of these practices informs us on how people learn. The case has been made over and over again that by including specific high leverage teaching practices into our course routines, more students can be reached and will engage deeply in the content. Specific practices have leverage that allow access to content and science skills that would otherwise have been nearly inaccessible to a variety of students. All of the science teaching practices are important and necessary as we work to engage all students in the high expectations required by our state standards. And I'd like to highlight the word all here. As we move through the slides, it is important to recognize that these evidence-based high leverage practices are designed to ensure that all students have access to science learning at high levels. In our short time, we'll briefly discuss the practices of eliciting, interpreting students' thinking, engaging students in sense making, and leading science discourse. It's our hope that as all educators move forward in their practice, attention will be paid and action taken towards all 8 of the practices. The practice of eliciting, interpreting students' thinking contains 6 elements as seen here. It's important to note here that the facet elements work in conjunction with each other within a facet. One element alone does not make the practice. This being said, the elements that we see listed here should be considered a gotta have it checklist for teachers at the end of the program heading into the classroom. Now, there are various classroom practices that teachers might be exposed to and utilize in their classroom that lifts multiple elements of eliciting ideas. One powerful and effective tool for eliciting student ideas is to begin a unit of instruction with an anchoring phenomena routine. While there exist a few variations of this routine, the elements exist in all. Students engage with and explore a phenomenon. They work to make sense individually and in small groups. They work to connect the phenomena to their own experiences and determine questions that they think need to be answered in order to explain the phenomenon. This specific routine is found in materials developed by Next Gen Storylines, which is led by Brian Reiser from Northwestern University. Other potential routines include the anchoring phenomena routine from Open Syed and from Ambitious Science Teaching out of the University of Washington. Of course, there are and will be other iterations of these tools, as well as new routines and tools developed to aid teachers in eliciting student ideas. So let's now explore the practice of engaging students in this idea of sense making. Of note, phenomena or problems are key aspects of this practice. In fact, in order for sense making to occur, students must have the opportunity to engage with something complex and puzzling enough to actually make sense of it throughout a unit of instruction. When we look closely at the elements of this practice, it reads like a script of where a teacher or a team of teachers can begin and continue to support students in the process of sense making. This process begins with planning for and engaging students with a phenomena or an anchoring event and questions that drive student sense making. So, what exactly is the practice of sense making? A good visual aid comes from the Task Annotation Project in Science, or TAPS for short. Sense making means that students gain insight into some relationship between ideas, representations of those ideas, and experiences that they have. So let's dive into this idea of sense making using a visualization tool. Each dot represents the ideas, abilities, and experiences that students have developed throughout their lives. Now, these can include disciplinary core ideas, cross-cutting concepts, and science practices, as well as explanations for particular kinds of phenomena or solutions to particular kinds of problems. Now, while sense-making was likely involved in developing these understandings, students no longer need to figure them out. When asked about them, the responses are more rote. Importantly, students have likely not connected many of these ideas before in particular ways to make sense of complex phenomena. So, at the beginning of instruction, a new phenomena or problem is presented that isn't immediately explainable by the student's prior experiences. And this phenomena or problem activate these ideas, these abilities, and prior experiences. Now, this may happen through direct or indirect cueing, scaffolding, or because of connections that students make themselves. Now, sense-making occurs when students connect their previously developed ideas, abilities, and experiences together to address the uncertainty presented by the phenomena, to figure out why the phenomenon occurs, to propose possible solutions or possible mechanisms, to ask further probing questions, and many more things. Now, this can be heavily or lightly scaffolded, and it can be independently or collaboratively pursued as long as students are still responsible for having to put these pieces together. Now, as the students progress in their understanding of the core science ideas by engaging in science practices through the lens of cross-cutting concepts, they're able to generate strong arguments, explanations, and solutions for the problem or phenomenon. And eventually, that whole experience becomes one that students can leverage as a schema or an understanding that they have figured out. And then they can connect that with others to figure out new phenomena or solve new problems. So, sense making is when students work to make sense of phenomena or problems, right? So, in this process, they're demonstrating this deep connection and understanding of the three dimensions, as well as how and when these things can be used to figure out the world around them. Another way to think about this concept of sense making is to consider the idea of moving students from an information frame, one in which the majority of knowledge and practice comes from the passing of information from the teacher to the student, to a sense-making frame, one in which the students are figuring out and explaining complex phenomena or solving problems. Now, if we put these ideas of an information frame and a sense-making frame on a continuum of practice, we can use this to reflect on where we are as educators in our shift towards sense-making. All educators are on this journey. Understanding that there's a goal and space to grow allows us to set goals, reach for something. Where might you fall in this continuum? And how might your teacher candidates place themselves in the continuum at different stages of their development? In the information frame, we're focused on students memorizing and understanding the process of photosynthesis as an important chemical process that most of life on Earth utilizes for survival, right? Directly or indirectly. Now, in general, students are not sense-making as the framework and standards describe. So how might we then begin engaging students in this practice of sense-making? Well, we do begin instruction by introducing a novel phenomena or a problem that students work to make sense of over time. So what might be some phenomena that students can investigate in order to understand and apply the concepts around photosynthesis? Maybe students work to make sense of the phenomena that a giant oak tree comes from a tiny acorn by investigating the question, where does all the matter come from? In chemistry, students in general work hard to understand, explain, and utilize the workings of important processes such as the carbon cycle, and use tools such as stoichiometry to understand and quantify important chemical relationships. While in every course, there are opportunities to apply these concepts to problems that are posed by the teacher or that come from a text, what if instead the students have to work to understand and utilize these concepts and tools to actually solve a complex real-world problem in a systematic way? So, for example, students might engage with the complex and novel phenomena of massive oyster larval die-offs connected to climate change. Potentially, throughout a unit of instruction, students work to model ocean acidification at the particle level, right? Maybe with hand-drawn and computational models. So they work with chemical equations in the context of the carbon cycle, use stoichiometric tools, and using chemically similar smaller scale systems. They might use mathematical and computational thinking to analyze this problem of larval die-offs. They might break the problem of oyster larval die-offs due to ocean acidification into these manageable subproblems. They might define and quantify social, technical, and environmental constraints surrounding this problem of oyster die-offs. And all throughout this process, students learn, deeply rooted in content and practice, how the carbon cycle is impacted by human activity, and use stoichiometry to aid in the development of solutions. Whatever the complex phenomena or the problem is, we use science and engineering practices that are named in the standards in the sense-making process. Sense-making requires the use of all the science practices, of the cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas. It is important to note that the science and engineering practices themselves do not work in isolation. When students are making sense of a phenomena or working to solve a problem, they'll be using multiple practices and cross-cutting concepts together and throughout a unit of instruction to learn core ideas and then use those ideas to explain and reason. And an important aspect of engaging students in phenomena-based instruction is ensuring student coherence in the learning. In other words, is the unit designed so that lessons help students make sense of the phenomena? Are students able to use the knowledge, understanding, and other assets gleaned from the lessons, and then use it to help reason through and explain the phenomena or solve that complex problem? A tool called storylines are intentional structures for units of instruction. So a storyline is a coherent sequence of lessons in which each step is driven by students' questions that arise from their interactions with the phenomena. A student's goal should always be to explain the phenomena or solve the problem. And at each step, students make progress in the classroom with questions through science and engineering practices to figure out a piece of a science idea. Each piece they figure out adds to the developing explanation, model, or design solution. Each step may also generate questions that lead to the next step in the storyline. Together, what students figure out helps explain the unit's phenomena or solve the problems that they've identified. A storyline provides a coherent path towards building these disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts, piece by piece, anchored in students' own questions. So, what makes a storyline different from just a sequence of lessons? Often, the importance of a particular problem or idea is clear to the teacher, but not to the students. For example, a teacher knows how learning about the cell will help with important biological questions. But for students, they're learning about cells because that's the title of the current chapter in the textbook. The teacher may know how a particular chemistry experiment will teach students something about the conservation of matter, but to the students, they're doing an experiment because they're following the directions. In a storyline, students should be involved in co-constructing the question that they're working on, and they should see the activities as helping them make progress on that question. In a storyline, the coherence is from the student's perspective, not just the teacher's. So let's shift now to this idea of an instructional framework, a development tool to help us design units of instruction. So instructional frameworks, and sometimes called instructional models, they represent the broadest level of instructional practices and present a philosophical orientation to instruction. Instructional models are used to select and to structure teaching strategies, methods, skills, and other student activities for a particular instructional emphasis. The example here is from the Ambitious Science Teaching Framework, and it was developed by the science education researchers at the University of Washington. So this works to help teachers, pre-service and practicing, to plan and implement instructional units that are phenomenon-based, rooted in the practices of modeling, argumentation, and explanation. They're grounded in student discourse with sense-making as the foundation of student learning and engagement. Here are two more models that use instructional frameworks to develop these types of instructional units. Not mentioned here, but also developed for sense-making include modeling instruction out of Arizona State University, model-based reasoning and biology out of the University of California, Berkeley, and the Carbon model from Michigan State University. I can include the modified 5E model, as well as others. It is important and extremely valuable to use the guidance of an instructional model or framework to guide our thinking about making these classroom shifts. If we don't have these as guides, it's easy for us as teachers to lose important aspects of sense-making, design, and implementation. So in review, we should consider sense-making the glue, the binding agent that connects all three dimensions to the vision of student learning and performance embodied by our three-dimensional standards in the framework for K-12 science education. Sense-making requires multiple dimensions. So while there may be meaningful one-dimensional performances that ask students to reason in one dimension in isolation, but sense-making requires that students use multiple dimensions together to explain a phenomena or solve a complex problem. And finally, meaningful sense-making requires a compelling phenomena, something uncertain that students need to figure out using their understanding of those three dimensions. And we'll end our discussion of science teaching practices today by focusing on the tie that binds, so to speak, right? And that's the practice of leading science discourse. And you'll notice here that, like the other science teaching practices, the elements are placed sequentially and can be used as a guide when planning for and implementing the practice with students. You'll also notice that many of the same keywords continually appear in elements throughout this facet and the other facets that we've detailed today. Talk, discourse, reasoning, phenomena, sense-making, planning, and on show the intertwined nature of these high-leverage teaching practices. As with eliciting student ideas and engaging students in sense-making, this facet has elements that speak to planning and classroom implementation. In order to aid in the complex science and art of creating meaningful and productive conversations that include opportunities for all students to engage and share their thinking and reasoning, educators should plan intentionally for high-impact discussion. Planning, coupled with the use of strategic tools such as talk moves, scaffolded question stems, cognitively demanding tasks, open-ended questions that are important for students to grapple with, and resources such as data or models give students the needed lift to engage in the science practices of argumentation and explanation. Now, there exist multiple tools for planning productive classroom discourse, each with a different take on the steps, but all really include common sub-practices. In general, the first step in planning discussion is deciding what students will talk about and posing an open-ended question. Students might focus on sharing predictions, explaining why something happens, or coming to consensus. Regardless, the question should be puzzling enough for students to want to figure it out, allow for various reasonable explanations or predictions, so there's no obvious one right answer, should have a way for students to access it, right? Their experience outside class or in class or other resources like data, video, readings, the periodic table, etc. It should ensure that students have what they need in order to engage in sense making during the discussion. It should also be that something that the group can make progress on during the discussion. And finally, it should be a question for which you yourself had thought about your own answer, as well as other possible ideas, things that students might also come up with. Frameworks, strategies, tools, and other resources are found from many sources. The evidence-based practice source materials shown here are powerful resources that we encourage educators to learn from and practice with. All share a common message. Productive discourse is a form of thinking. Students engaging in this form of talk make their thinking public for you and the class, so their ideas are resources for others. A culture of discourse in the classrooms helps us understand who is silent so we can diagnose and take action. And that science discourse is a specialized language that apprentices students into the practice of science. Now, the videos posted on this slide are examples of teachers engaging students in productive academic discussions in different contexts for various purposes. While we'll not show the videos in this webinar, it is helpful to watch and see how different educators engage students in productive talk to push for reasoning as they develop their sense-making repertoires. Leading discussions in the ways described by the standards will look and sound different depending on the context, the purpose, and expected outcomes of the discussion. However, in each, you will notice that teachers use specific tools, such as talk moves, scaffolds, to push student thinking and make their reasoning public for their peers to work with. You'll also find links to other helpful resources that will aid you in the practice of leading group discussions, as well as tools for teaching this to others.
Thanks for your interest in learning more about the Science Teacher Preparation Standards. As a reminder, here are some key resources upon which the standards development relied if you'd like to learn more. All can be accessed in the resource materials that partner this webinar or in the appendices of the standards documents. This webinar is part of a series introducing the standards for the preparation of middle grades and high school science teachers. You can access all 4 webinars on OEE's YouTube site. You can also find slides and recordings from the MSTA 2023 Symposium, where there were several panels and keynote speakers who discussed the new standards and their implementation. Thank you so much for watching this webinar today. We invite you to share your feedback at the linked survey or using the QR code on the screen. Please also follow the Office of Educator Excellence on social media and subscribe to our newsletter, Educationally Speaking. And please do send any questions or comments about these standards and their implementation to me at mcmahond2@michigan.gov. Thank you.